Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm going to be talking about French fascism between the world wars. The story of French fascism after World War II is kind of quite a long one, probably more involved than we've got time for today. But I obviously will return to it. And I think there's a lot we can learn by studying comparative fascisms. Most of the time we talk about Nazism, which I'd say is almost a slightly aberrant variant of fascism, which has its own particular racial characteristics to it. Not that there aren't racial characteristics in the fascisms, but they are quite distinct within Nazism. And there are the Italian and French fascisms and other European fascisms have probably kind of a lot more in common with each other than they do with Nazism. So, looking at the variants of fascism that we don't normally tend to examine because they were not fascisms that really made it, that really became state regimes, can be very useful and very interesting. Now, the story we're going to focus on today begins in 1919, following the end of the First World War and the post-war Paris Peace Conference. And the government of Georges Clemenceau is this resurgent nationalist government that really embraces the sacrifices of the war as something wholly positive, whilst previously the invasion of Germany in the Franco-Prussian War, or Prussia and German states during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, was seen as a national humiliation and a terrible tragedy, and nationalism between 1870 and 1914 was of this angry, revanchist character. Post-war French nationalism saw that despite the horrors of the war, despite the war that pushed the French army to the point of mutiny, and despite the fact that the French suffered comparatively greater casualties than any other army, the war itself had a cleansing effect, that the martyrdom had resulted in victory, and France had been vindicated, France's honour had been restored, and this creates an environment for radical nationalism to prosper. And it first develops in the guise of the group Action Française. Clemenceau's government, the Bloc National, engaged in a patriotic culture. A lot of it was based around Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, as a saintly figure who should be remembered for having rescued and saved France from the English in the 15th century. However, the thing about fascism and fascisms in general is they tend to look deep into the past to find narratives that create a coherent sense of the nation, and thus a way of guiding it into an uncertain future. Action Française was a monarchical proto-fascist group. They were, I suppose, the fact that France was one of the first republics of modern Europe meant that radical right-wing politics might take a kind of monarchical turn. Again, fascisms are very frequently all about restorations of old orders, bringing back things that were once great and glorious, even though, if indeed they actually weren't very great or glorious at all. Charles Maurras, the leading figure in Action Française, argued that republics were weak and that everything that had really happened to the French Republic, if you not including Napoleon, had been generally extremely bad. The problem for Action Française and other fascist groups on the right was that they weren't likely to enjoy the same success as the right in both Italy and Germany, because the threat from the left was not in any way as considerable. Mussolini's rise to power by 1922 in Italy is largely based on a fear of a very imminent communist revolution. By the early 1920s, the fear is still of a resurgent Germany. The fact that there's been a communist revolution in Russia means that if Germany went to war against France again, there would be almost no chance of Russia being France's key ally, as Russia had traditionally been on the continent. The British seemed to be more engaged with the problems of their own empire, and America was slipping away into isolationism. So a robust policy of holding Germany down was far more important. And this was a narrative that was much more easily captured by the political centreground. It's something that all French people, by and large, agreed on, and it left very little territory for the extreme right to exploit. When Action Française attacked the left, they physically assaulted trade unionists and socialists. It actually encouraged left-wing parties to coalesce together and work together. In 1924, the left parties formed the Cartel de Gauche, which won the 1924 legislative elections. So, in fact, actually, fascist violence backfired and unified the left. And it's often tempting to wonder what might have happened in Germany if the democratic and revolutionary left had aligned themselves together. But, unfortunately, we can't really engage in counterfactuals on that one. It was the election of the Cartel de Gauche that seems to kind of change things, however. Firstly, between 1920 and 24, there had been 7 governments come and go, and the electoral system seemed extremely fragile. The French bourgeoisie, the propertied classes, are very nervous about the election of the Cartel de Gauche, and they see large tax rises and the possibility of property loss and all sorts of creeping Bolshevism. And there is a kind of a fear that possibly more extreme alternatives, perhaps on the right, need to be adopted in order to counter this. As Germany emerged from diplomatic isolation by the mid-1920s, and anxieties about Germany re-emerged, and you have the development of a more organised political left, this gives rise to new, more radical nationalist groups. The Jeunes Patriotes, for example, emerge in response to the Cartel de Gauche. And they were led by Pierre Taittinger, who was fascinated by Mussolini and fascinated by the ability that Mussolini and fascism in Italy seemed to have to radicalise the youth and galvanise young people. He saw that the French left was a growing force and thought that there was nothing on the electoral or the constitutional right that could possibly deal with it. The Jeunes Patriotes were a kind of a heady mixture of extreme French nationalism, anti-communism, and Catholicism, the defence of Catholicism. And they managed to collect together some 65,000 supporters by about 1926. And many were bored and disempowered young men, perhaps war veterans, who were attracted to the violence in much the way that the black shirts in Italy and the Freikorps in Germany were. That ultimately, as one historian put it, when referring to the Freikorps and then later the brown shirts, that the appeal was there were going to be some fist fights, a few beers, a little bit of pocket money, and some bloody good fun to be had out of causing mayhem. You'd like to think that there was a kind of a more ideological underpinning to fascism sometimes, but apparently not. Many of the groups on the right, including the Jeunes Patriotes, were less political parties than leagues and associations. social clubs, if you will, with an ideological bent for people, normally ex-servicemen, to coalesce and kind of act out their own kind of political views and beliefs, and gain some sort of shared sense of allegiance from. There was no suggestion in the Jeune Patriote of a kind of a transformative and revolutionary creed to upend society and create some kind of new racial or social order. It was really a sort of broad-based populism. One figure in the kind of the morass of French fascism who's quite interesting is that of Georges Valois, who founded the Fascism, or the fascist party. And he is this meeting of the French tradition, the Proudhonist tradition of French anarchism, with fascism. He'd originally been in the Action Française, but as he'd grown up in immense poverty, and been inclined towards anarchism. And Valois eventually adopts these standard fascist social Darwinist ideas, and which seem to be at real odds with anarchist thinking. He believed that ultimately. I began to believe that ultimately man was idle and weak until forced by a higher power, a higher authority, and a strong leader to reach his true potential. Really, the antithesis of anarchist thinking. He was a massive contradictions, as many fascists really are. On one side, rejecting bourgeois materialism and bourgeois culture, and believing in a certain kind of Spartan asceticism, but also believing in material growth and GDP growth and developing the economy, because it would underpin defence and welfare. And he was a key figure in creating an organisation called the Cercle Proudhon, which brought together Proudhonist anarchists and syndicalists with Action Française fascists. Valois eventually rejects the Action Française, calling them elitists, and many of them were fascist intellectuals and quite removed from the lives of the French working classes. When Valois visited Italy at the behest of the new fascist government in 1923, he came back with an idea that a political movement in the guise of the Fascism could be created that would appeal to both left and right, would reach beyond the narrow confines of the political spectrum. Valois himself has something of a tragic fate. By the mid-1920s, his movement had about 30,000 members, and its opponents on the right, people like Maurras, implied that he was in the pay of Italy, and used influence to strangle the money that Valois had managed to gain from industry as part of their kind of anti-trade union activities. By 1929, the Fascism was broke and it was out of money and was abandoned. And Valois himself seems to gradually have distanced himself from fascism, so much so that during the Second World War, when France is invaded, Valois joined the resistance, and was finally caught by the Nazis and died at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in 1945. One of the factors that was France's saving grace was that once the Depression hit France quite hard, though later on, the Depression really begins in France in 1936, it never really destabilises French society. French society seems to be much more robust than that of Germany. and the French society seems to be able to kind of absorb the Great Depression in a way that the German society can't. In 1927, a organisation, the Croix de Feu, was founded for ex-servicemen, and whilst associated with being a fascist organisation, it had less of an ideological programme and more of a reactionary agenda, simply reacting to a host of things it viewed as objectionable or threatening, mainly the threat of communism and socialism in France. Their leader, a former French army colonel Larocque, also embraced some broadly populist, not Marxist, I would argue, broadly populist anti-capitalist points. A loathing of banks and the finance. The system of finance that seemed to only enrich the tiny minority, and of course into this comes anti-Semitism, as Jews are popularly associated with finance and money lending. As we know, if you look back to the Dreyfus affair, France has a long and impressive history of anti-Semitism. Normally, we associate anti-Semitism with Germany, but in terms of anti-Semitic outrages between the 1890 and 1930, probably France has far more instances of that. It was the Croix de Feu that had the greatest success in the long run in groups on the extreme right. By opening the doors to not just former servicemen but to the general public, and by creating a brown shirt style paramilitary organisation, the Croix de Feu membership expanded from 30,000 in 1933 to 500,000 by 1936. The effect on the left in France is pronounced. So during the 20s, where there had been a bit of a phony war between the left and right, that really changes by 1934. In tandem to this were developed within the Parti Communiste Français, which was of course a Comintern party, and which was given its instructions by Moscow. After the shock of Hitler's appointment in January 1933, Stalin began to rethink his ideas of accusing social democratic parties of being, as he called them, social fascists, and being, in his view, far more dangerous than any fascist party going. He suddenly realised that actually alliances between the democratic left and the revolutionary left were probably very useful from fending off the development of a fascist Europe, which might well wind up being set on Russia like some kind of attack dog. This, in turn, results in the development of the Popular Front government in 1936, which again has a profound reaction on the right, particularly as the socialist Jewish Prime Minister Leon Blum comes to power in that year. And 1936 is a year of economic crisis, of radical left politics becoming more established, and also a year when union militancy becomes far more mainstream and far more sporadic. The level of strikes and sit-ins and wage demands allow the more paranoid on the right to think that perhaps this is the prelude to a revolution. One of the first acts of Leon Blum's government was to ban fascist paramilitaries, particularly as in the run-up to the election he'd actually been violently assaulted by them, so perhaps didn't have much of a sense of humour about that sort of thing. And the response of this banning was for certain small groups to develop, such as the Comité Secret d'Action Révolutionnaire, called rather ludicrously Cagoule as an acronym, to begin a terrorist war against the French state. And so there's a small but not inconsiderable number of bombings and assassinations took place. La Roque and transformed the Croix de Feu into the Parti Social Français, to move it away from the idea that it was a militia into a mainstream electoral fascist party. By 1937, it appeared to have 1 million members, and 3 million by 1939. And initially, the party had mainly white-collar, upper-middle-class members, but by the later 1930s, this huge upsurge in numbers came from the French peasantry and the working classes. But it was the Parti Populaire Français that, again, by the eve of World War II, had 600,000 members. That was the most explicitly fascist, with the most clearly articulated racial and anti-Semitic views, and the once again holding on to the myth of Joan of Arc and the symbolism of Joan of Arc, and the idea that of a sanctified exceptionalist French nation, blessed by history and deemed to have this great and glorious patriotic future. But it was the decline of the Popular Front that gives us a clue as to the popularity of these parties. As the Popular Front goes into decline by 1938, funding for these fascist parties dries up. So it was clearly French capital who were putting up the money to pay for these extreme right-wing organisations, in the belief that it was somehow undermining this elected socialist regime. And once a more conservative regime under Daladier returns to power, then there is no need to worry too much about an elected socialist government, and thusly the funds for the PCF and the PPF tend to dry up quite considerably. So the fascism in France has mixed blessings throughout the interwar period. It never manages to have its electoral or mass movement breakthrough moment, though there are large numbers of people in extreme nationalist and fascist parties. The centre manages to hold fairly successfully for most of the period, and certainly by 1939, if not in terms of membership, but then in terms of finance, the fascist right are in decline. But, and there's a significant but here, the invasion of Germany in 1940 and the creation of the Vichy regime was influenced really by this period of time. The Vichy regime, which had openly fascist policies, was not unpopular by any stretch of the imagination. There were people who supported it. They did not consider themselves to be necessarily oppressed by it or reluctant to be ruled by it. And why might this be so? Well, because throughout the 1930s, a large number of potentially fascist voters and supporters had coalesced around these parties, and they coalesced around these parties that existed to coalesce around because of the various social and economic pressures of the Great Depression and fears about communism, about French national decline, about the romanticisation of the sacrifice of the war, and about the glorification of militarism. All these factors and the need for French citizens to, in these conditions, to imagine a sense of nationhood and national identity, create a rich breeding ground for fascist ideas. And it's the opportunity that is granted to fascism comes with Hitler and invasion. I hope you found that useful, and you can now find the entire back catalogue of Explaining History podcasts on the new look, all vamped up, and not quite finished yet, to be perfectly honest with you, Explaining History website. And I will be adding more features to it soon to make it a richer user experience for you guys. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll catch you on the next podcast. All the best. Thanks. Bye bye.